Hi everyone, this is Navika Chada, cloud engineer and a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in Azure. I warmly welcome each one of you to the 26th episode of Tech Chat with Navika, wherein today we would be diving into the world of Azure storage. And for that, we have a very prominent and an experienced professional and a speaker for us today, that is Greg Schulz. Greg is the founder and a senior advisor of the independent IT advisory, consultancy, and creative service firm StorageIO. Additionally, he's been a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional for consecutive 9 years. He is an extremely experienced and learned professional with more than 40 years of working experience in the IT industry. Greg is an author of several renowned books. His area of expertise lies in IT advisory, strategy, research, content creation, data storage, strategies, product review, marketing, collateral development, writing, public speaking. And you know what? I'm going to stop here because the list is pretty long. Thank you so much, Greg, for joining me in today. And please, if you would like to add on to your introduction, because you've done a whole lot of things, and I would like to give this to you now.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you, Navika. Honor, privilege to be with you and your audience talking today. It's there's a lot there, and over time, having been the customer, having been the vendor, analyst, consultant, a lot of different, have seen a lot of different things, a lot of different industries and organizations. But hey. And congratulations on you being an MVP and as you continue your journey. Hey, let's talk about Azure today and particular Azure Storage, which you teed up. Yeah. The thing about Azure Storage is that a lot of people, when they hear cloud, they hear storage, right away they're like, oh, objects. It's all about objects. It's like, well, but guess what? There's life beyond objects, which I think we're going to talk about today, particularly when it comes to Azure.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think let's start on that note, and I cannot wait for the next 20-25 minutes of tech podcast with you. So let's get started then. So as you mentioned, yes, we're going to be talking about Azure Storage today. And, I think one of the best advantage of Azure Storage is that it offers us a variety of options to store different type of data in different types of ways. So to get started with it, Craig, for the audience who is new to Azure Storage, would you like to give an overview of what Azure Storage is all about and the different type of Azure Storage options that it offers?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you said a key thing there, Navika, which is, you know what? Everything is not the same. So why do you treat everything the same? It's usually because of the result of if all you have is a hammer in your toolbox, everything's going to look like a nail. If all you've got is a screwdriver, so hopefully you get that analogy. And the thing there is that you need to have multiple tools, multiple technologies that then using different techniques for different needs. Okay. And that's where we come to with Azure Storage, because out there in the real world, the wild, there's more than just one type of storage. You got block, you got file, you got object, you got solid state, you've got tape. Yes, tape still does exist, even in the cloud. But you've got all these, but it's how you go about using them. So in the case of Azure, there's different types. And when we talk about that, certainly there are the blobs. Blobs are similar to what you would call an object like AWS, but you've got blobs. But the big difference is that with Azure, you've got page blobs, you've got block blobs, and you've got append blobs. So what is that you need to do? If you're being told we have to go object, okay, well, blob is an object. Okay, we have to go blob. All right, what is it that you're going to do? Well, we just want to store a big bunch of data really cheap. Okay. So you want to go probably a block blob. Yeah, but we're going to keep adding to it all the time. Oh, sounds more like you're going to be doing logging, event notification, append. Yeah, you might want to look at append blogs or blobs, excuse me. Okay, but wait a minute. What if I just want to do like virtual disk, like a VHD or a VHDX or VMDK, something like that? Well, then you might want to take a look at page blobs. So right off the bat, because you've got these different use scenarios, hence you've got these different kinds of blobs. And the thing that also factors in, as we talk about some more of these Azure storage options, are that you've got different services in different regions, geo and redundancy, stuff like that. But you also have your different redundancy options. You're going to make it local redundant, geo redundant. You can have replication turned on. What about encryption, your security access controls, things like that? Those are common tenets, but also are things like the different tiers category. That is it going to be a blob? And here, I just want to dump data, and it's going to be high performance. I need to be able to do both a lot of reads and writes into that bucket, into that container. Well, then you may want to put it into a performance class tier. Okay. Not all blobs are cheap, low cost, because that low cost could get you into a lot of trouble if all of a sudden you deploy something because, hey, this is really, really low cost. Okay. And all of a sudden people are calling and say, hey, you know what? I thought clouds are supposed to be fast. Well, they are. Well, how come our apps are running so slow? Well, did you happen to select the lowest cost cold tier? Well, yeah. Well, guess what? Migrate that to a faster tier. So those apply with your blobs, with your objects. And not just, so what else is there besides blobs? Well, files. Okay. It's easy to say is that, well, with around cloud, the focus has been on object because it is something new. It's a shiny new toy, shiny new technology, and it has a lot of capabilities. But for the most part, the world and most apps today, traditional apps, are still file-based. They're still file-based. They might be doing things object internally, whatever that happens to be. But think about like with a cell phone or a camera, whatever that, whether it's a cell phone, a regular camera, or even a drone. When you capture an image, it's using DCIM and storing things ultimately in files, but it's also chunking things out. So file is that native universal sort of language, hence that applicability still. But within Azure, you've got different kinds of files. You have Azure files that could be NFS, it could be SMB based. But you also have this thing called NetApp files. What's that? NetApp? Yeah, it's NetApp running on Azure. You mean physical machines? No, it could just be their software running as a software or a storage as a service sort of offering. Why? For compatibility with existing NetApp environments where people have done the lift and shift, the move, the migrate, but they want to have that common management, the common tool capabilities, hence that compatibility there. But with Azure files, that's just files that I can say, I want fast transactional, I want cold for archiving, I'm going to use it in different ways. And then that sets the stage for something else tied to files, which is Azure File Sync, also known now as Storage Sync, which is kind of an interesting one, which is that you set up your Azure files, hot, cold, transactional, however you want it. And then you set up storage sync groups. And what I describe is people goes, oh, that's OneDrive. No, it's not OneDrive. What it does, you say you've got a share up on SMB, up on Azure, pick the region, and then you say, hey, you know what? I've got these on-prem servers that I want to make them the effectively cache copies. Azure is going to be my master, my authoritative copy. But on these different servers that are out wherever, they are going to be cache, or they could be authoritative for that matter. But then anything that goes into that share gets synced down to those different servers. Anything that goes into one of those servers, depending on how you configure it, gets synced back up to Azure. Okay. Does that mean that it's only for on-prem? No, you could have different servers on different virtual machines running within Azure, or even at a different location. It could be on an AWS or a Google Cloud, whatever, that then the storage sync not only goes from the servers running at those different clouds out to those different on-prem or edge, but then syncs back up to Azure, where then you can use all that common management interface, things like that. It's one of those things that, okay, files, yeah, good, NFS, SMB, etc. But I think that's a really interesting capability. It's something that I actually use myself. So let me just pause there for a moment. Any questions so far?
No, no, not at all. In fact, thank you so much because you're also explaining the use cases along with that, which makes it much easier to understand for someone who is new to Azure as to what are the different use cases and when can they use which type of storage. So I think that's really insightful for the audience for sure.
Good. So we've talked about blobs, we've talked about files, we've talked about file storage
Okay.
sync. Is you know, everything, there's focus that, well, cloud's got to be object, clouds okay, files are okay, block it. Well, guess what? Everything is based on block, whether you realize it or not. Deep down in the stack, layers and layers of abstraction, there's still blocks. Well, about a year or so ago, Microsoft Azure came out with something called Elastic SAN. How, if you're really tied on your edge, on your on-prem, or even on the cloud, and you're trying to do that migrate, some of it's lift and shift, some of it's just move, get it out of here, send it off to the cloud. One of the ways to do that, especially if you're still running, SAP, HANA, Oracle, SQL Server, whatever it happens to be, and you can't just simply do that database move per se, where you have to move more of that underlying capability. That's where Elastic SAN comes into play. And what it is, it's block storage that's set up and configured for performance, for transactional, throughput, low latency, high IOP sort capabilities with resiliency. And the endpoints can be within Azure, so across your different virtual machines, whether they're Windows-based or whatever. Currently, it's an iSCSI. So if you've got a host, whether it's a virtual machine, whether it's a container, whatever it happens to be, if it can speak iSCSI, it can connect to a Elastic SAN endpoint. Likewise, that could be an on-prem, or it could be at the edge. So I could have a server or even a desktop that, as long as it can speak iSCSI and make that connection, make that secure connection back into Azure, now all of a sudden I can be talking into a storage pool, a storage resource that my application is currently running at the edge, or is currently running at on-prem, and my destination is to get the data over to Azure, but I want to keep operating over here, and then at some point I'm going to cut over, or this is going to be an active failover situation. That's where the Elastic SAN comes into play. It's one of those capabilities that, for those that have to keep the existing environments running while you're moving them, while you're migrating, it's a great way of doing hybrid. I've got a nice blog piece on that I did about a year or so ago that goes into more in depth. But again, it's for the cloud-based, whether it's on Microsoft Azure, whether it's on AWS, Google, go down that list. It's for regular VMs. It's for containers. In fact, part of it is that it's there, Elastic SAN, is to support AKS, Azure Kubernetes Services. So you want persistent storage for AKS. Guess what? It could be file, it could be object, it could also be block-based using the Elastic SAN. So we've got that. We certainly have Azure managed disks, which are your disks when you create a virtual machine or anything that requires that managed storage within Azure that you're going to attach to a virtual machine per se. So you've got that, and you've got different types, you've got different tiers, different categories for different performance, availability, capacity, economic concerns. But that storage has that affinity with that compute resource, as opposed to these others that we've talked about. They can have that affinity with that Azure compute service resource, but they can also have endpoints that are going out into the rest of the world. So that's why you have things like the Azure Container Storage, which just gives you that ability to access blobs, access files, access Elastic SAN, in addition to having the different managed disks, which are that affinity to the that virtual machine that computes, similar to like an AWS, like an EBS, Elastic Block Storage. But there's a couple others that you don't quite hear about all that much when it comes to storage. So yeah, we got the basic, the block, the file, the blobs, and different variations for different needs. But there's also this thing called table storage. Well, what's that? Storage sitting on a table? No, it's a little bit more than that. It's storage that's presented as a table space, as a NoSQL. In other words, you want to do something where you want to store it in a table type repository, in a NoSQL type repository, but you don't want to necessarily subscribe to a SQL service or any of the NoSQL type services. So I think the key concept here is think layers, building blocks. And as you go up layers, you're putting more services with more definition, with more functionality, with more capabilities, but they're all built on these underlying mechanisms. So table storage is you want some basic service that is more than a file, more than a blob, that's got some organization to it. That'd be table. Same thing with message queues. Message queues is that if you've got an app where it's a services based, where you've got messages coming in, and a message might be 16 bytes, it might be 64K bytes of data just coming in as a message, as information, a telemetry feed, whatever, that's maybe coming in from an IoT type device. And you want to hold that persistently. In other words, where if you lose power or whatever, it's not going to go away. The message queue is that capability where your data is arriving as incoming message packets, as opposed to a file read, a file write. And that's where message queues come in. But then that sets us up, whereas we've talked about these layers, the block, the blobs, the files, this layering, this is where we come into the data lakes. And the data lake is just yet another service, another layering of adding, where we've gone from the lower level building up this hierarchy of services. With the data lake, it's abstracting the underlying blobs and the underlying storage that then presents out a data analytics, a data warehouse sort of interface. For example, big data, Hadoop. You want to do stuff with Hadoop. Well, there's connectors there for that, where you don't want to build your own. You don't want to go out and set up the blob, set up the file, set up all the different things like that. You want to just work with something a little bit higher up. That's where the data lake is. Similar to here, you want everything turnkey with a SQL Server sort of presentation, or maybe a Cassandra, Mongo, whatever it happens to be. Well, that's where you could go to one of those higher level services. But if you say, no, I want to go down a layer, craft it, define it, shape it, scope it, manage it at a bigger scale, then you can come down a layer and say, okay, here, I'm going to take my compute, I'm going to set it up for a SQL Server, I'm going to set it up for Cassandra, Mongo, etc. Here, I'm going to configure my underlying storage, or you can just go up to one of those services. That's where we have those different options. So then that brings us to two others that also don't get a lot of attention, but are interesting building blocks, if you would. And one of those is the concept of vaults, VAULTS, vaults. Think like a bank vault. And it's a way where it's a service, so it's a layered that, so for example, data protection, backup, disaster recovery, business continuance, where you're protecting your blobs, you're protecting your different apps, your different services, and the protection are going into these vaults. And the vaults are just storage organized, that data is, say, replicated or snapshotted or copied out of your regular blobs or your Elasticsearch, whatever it happens to be, into these vaults, which are just an encapsulation that makes it easier for protecting, but they're also preserved because they're in a different tenant and a different subscription than where your regular apps are running. So that's the basics on a vault. But then there's this interesting one called Data Box. Data Box, to me, I'm a big fan of Data Box. I've used it a couple of times. And what it is, it's a service. There's two variations. One is a gateway where this device sits on-prem or at the edge, and it's just helping to collect data and send it, replicate it, synchronize it back. So think bigger synchronization, broader synchronization than that storage sync we talked about, where it's helping to migrate or it's helping to move. Or it could be that you don't have a good, fast connection. So we need to like trickle the data across, Or here, periodically, we're going to pay for the service and have large amounts of data packaged up and shipped to Azure. You might be offshore, an oil well. You might be something where you have to drop offline for long periods of time, and you want to collect that data, have it. So that could be for capture, migrate, but it could also be for business continuance, disaster recovery. And where I've used it for personally is collecting large amounts of data that would take way too long to send over the network, where just bundle it up and then get shipped back. And the packaging is as simple as a box of solid state drives show up. You put up an adapter on them, plug them in your computer, and put them into block blobs, page blobs, whatever it happens to be. And then they go back securely, and all of a sudden they show up in your storage account some amount of time later. So again, for that big migration. So Data Box is an interesting one for that bulk move, or where you don't have a big connection. Say you're out somewhere and you've collected so much video or so much seismic data, whatever it happens to be, that you just can't quickly get it back. And quickly might be like days or a week, whatever, via network. Great, ship it, package it up. In the old days, we would have said, here, put it on tape and ship it out. Well, today you're going to put it on solid state and ship it out. So anyway, that's a quick summary of Azure Cloud Storage, life beyond blobs and objects.
Thank you so much for such a detailed and comprehensive detailing of each of the storage types. That was really insightful, and I think when we see from the perspective of performance optimization and cost optimization, which is like really important, definitely pillars of what you call infrastructure in general. One of the best practices, I think, it's from that perspective, it is really important to know the use cases of each of these storage types. Accordingly, one can go ahead, according to the needs and requirements, to optimize the performance and cost respectively. So I think we have covered that part as well in the first question. Thanks for that. I would just be picking up a couple of storage types that you've just described for the next 3 to 4 questions, which can give us a better overview of each one of those. Starting with the next question, Greg, as you mentioned about ADLS, that is Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage, and Azure Blobs, if we were to know the difference between these two storage types, right? So if you can just let us know the difference between ADLS, that is Azure Data Lake Storage, Gen 2 versus Azure Blob Storage. So what's that going to be?
Yeah, real simple. As I mentioned a little earlier, think about, you've got your basic building blocks, and then you're building additional capability services on top of that. And with Azure Data Lake, there was the generation 1, which was actually deployed out on a high performance parallel file system, whereas Gen 2 is actually built on top of the blob. So you could go out and you could build out, say, for example, your own HDFS, for if you were, say, doing Hadoop or something like that. You could build that out, configure it, define it on your own using blob storage, using the different techniques that we've touched on. Or you could go turnkey and say, hey, I just want to go to the data lake. I want to sidestep a lot of that activity. So the big thing with Gen 2 is that it is based on blobs. It is actually built on top of the Azure blobs, and then leveraging that capability for better scalability, better performance, better availability, durability, all those good things, which then makes it easier for attaching different sorts of access methods for different personalities, things like that.
Right. Perfect. Thank you. And one more thing which I wanted to ask was, as we're talking about Azure storage, and definitely storage of different type of data, and as we're talking about data, one very important thing that comes into the picture is data protection, right? And then we have tools like Azure Site Recovery or Azure Backup, which sort of helps us implement the data protection. If I were to associate this question of data protection with Azure storage, how do you think that we can integrate Azure storage disks with tools like Azure Site Recovery or Azure Backup, which can help us with comprehensive data protection?
Yeah, great point there. And you mentioned, say, Azure Managed Disk. So in other words, the storage, the persistent storage that is attached to a virtual machine, you could certainly use things like the ASR, the Azure Site recovery, the different data protection tools, using the vaults, using the scheduled backups, the replication, stuff like that. And the thing about that is that keep in mind that you've got that ability now to protect at different layers, at different granularities, different frequencies. So you might say here, at some interval, protect the entire volume, protect the entire managed disk. And that's also going to be set up with your different durability, local, your different geo, using LRS, LRC, etc. But then you can come up a layer and say, yeah, but you know what? I want to do another layer of replication versus just straight snapshot and backup copies. And that's also where you've got that ability to say, hey, you know what? Not only do I want to put it, say, to a different object or a different blob or file system, whatever it happens to be, but hey, you know what? I want to put a copy into that vault. I want to put a copy into that. I want to subscribe to the Azure protection vault because that vault is in a different subscription, in a different tenant. Microsoft is protecting it. I could potentially use that as my air gap copy to guard against ransomware, some things like that. So it comes back to where you can use that as a way of saying, here, for that particular layer, turn on the layers protection capability, whether it's the block, the blob, the file. But I also want to use that. I want to define that, craft that, put it together to meet the different requirements. Maybe higher up, you've got a SQL Server, something like that, that you want to say, yeah, you know what? I want to snapshot into this vault. I want to put my a log into that vault. However you want to do that to meet your particular needs. That's that nice thing about having these different tools and then being able to use those in different ways versus treating everything the same.
Absolutely, absolutely. And actually, you just covered that. I was about to just repeat the point that you just said. And thanks for that. And actually, Greg, now we have sort of covered really like in-depth points. We have discussed about what Azure storage is all about. We have discussed about different types of Azure storage, the use cases and scenarios where we should use each one of those. And then we have also covered data protection. Then we have also covered Azure Data Lake, ADLS, and Blob storage, and the difference between those. And I think as we are nearing towards the end of the podcast, one important topic that I would like to touch base upon is data migration. And as you also mentioned in your, I think that was the last storage type that you described, that was Azure Data Box. So I would actually like to take that as a separate question now that we are nearing towards the end. How do you think that Azure Data Box can sort of simplify this large scale data migration, the entire process? So if you would like to throw some light on that.
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to is if you've got the network, you've got the time to be able to move data. Great. Send it over that network. Send it over that network if you can. Okay. Just, from a time and a standpoint, it's so, and that's where you also have tools like the migrator tools that help with that migration, with the planning, the assessment, that insight, that inventory to help you put together your bill of materials and leverage the recommendations on how to go about doing that migrating your data, migrating your VMs and things like that. But then where the data box comes into play is that you either have so much data, you can't effectively migrate it over the network in a given amount of time, either because of network bandwidth restrictions or whatever it happens to be. It's a way of doing that move, but then where you can do stuff like, here, let's move the bulk of the data with a bulk move from wherever to Azure. Okay. Now, once it's inflated, rehydrated, and put into Azure, in that whole time, when you're using the data box, it is protected. It is encrypted. There's a whole process which has become very, very easy to use, where you go about setting up your credentials and doing the migrate, etc. Once that's into Azure, then you can say, hey, you know what? Let's use maybe storage sync to be able to start trickling up the changes. I can say, here, Azure, here's my new file system. Okay, let's take that. Now, any changes that we've set up at these endpoints, or anything that we're using the Data Box appliance or any of the different tools, now start applying the differential changes, which are going to be a lot less painful over that network. We've done the bulk move. Now let's start applying the incremental changes, whether it's to virtual machines, data per se. That helps to facilitate that. Once everything is in sync, everything is balanced, then we say, okay, fine. Now this on the Azure side is the master authoritative copy, or it's the live virtual machine, whatever that happens to be, you're able to do it. I mean, you could use, say, for example, in Hyper-V, say, hey, I'm going to do Hyper-V replication migration from the edge on-prem over to Azure. Okay, great. Hope you got a good network. As you go about doing that, you could also say, here, we're going to take this snapshot, this move, then we're going to bulk move things, then we'll replicate, get everything in sync. And then, of course, you've got the different Azure-based tools to help manage that, coordinate that, whether you're coming from VMware into Azure, or you're going from VMware on Edge on-prem to VMware on Azure, which is yet another layering service. So you've got all those different capabilities.
Thank you so much for such a detailed explanation. Really appreciate it.
No worries.
And this brings us towards the end of the podcast. But is there any other topic which you think in Azure Storage you would like to touch base on?
I think, you mentioned data protection. And certainly you have, we've talked about the vaults, we've talked about the data protection, different things like that. There's another service, a portal called the BC Center, the Business Continuity Center. It's a new dashboard. It's a new tool that allows you to see your vaults, see your different resources. Are they protected or not? And think of it as that, yeah, everything is looking good today. We're covered. Yay. All right. Okay. Or to give you a warning like, uh-oh, something's not, we need to go look at and make sure, why aren't we protecting these resources over here? So there's some things there, which are they storage? Are they data protection? Are they compute? You know what? They all come together. And that's the concept around data infrastructures, is that they combine, the compute, the storage, the networking, the hardware, all the different layers that come together that then you define into being that service or whatever it is that you're crafting. So, those are some things to keep in mind.
True. And I think if we see from a larger perspective and not just Azure Storage as well, I think how should I say that? How should I put it? Like, this is true for the entire Azure infrastructure in general, irrespective of the service that we are using. I mean, these are some pillars that supports the entire infrastructure, which is like performance, cost optimization, security, keeping a entire check on your performance, what's performing good, what's not, and that is directly proportional to the cost as well. Scaling up and scaling down the resources, as you mentioned about the redundancy options, for example, which is again directly proportional to the cost, right? So I think everything just sort of melts down and boils down to the same crux of being aligning to all these best practices of Azure infrastructure.
Yeah.
Great.
And if I could real quickly, there's an acronym I use. In other words, performance, availability, capacity, and economics. Papa, Alpha, Charlie, Echo. Okay. And if you think about that, every application, every workload has some attribute of performance. It might be high, low, or none. Has some level of availability, which includes data protection, security, durability, resiliency, all those things. It has some aspect of capacity, that's space, the number of ports, things like that, and an economic concern. So you want to keep those in considerations when you're looking at the application, the workload, but then turn that around and then let's say, oh, wait a minute. Now that makes sense of these different resources, these different tools, and their different pace attributes. And you want to learn more about that, here, check out this, Software Defined Data Infrastructure Essentials. It's one of my books. It's not
Oh,
exactly a thin one. Yeah. But what this does is breaks down on, okay, tell me more about blobs and objects. Tell me more about blocks. Tell me more about files. And where it's not Azure centric, it's not AWS centric, it's not Google, Oracle, whatever. It's more neutral, but with different examples, including multiple chapters on data protection.
absolutely, absolutely. And to all the audience, please head over wherever book.
StorageIOblog.com.
Yep, please head over there and have a look at the book as well. Thank you so much, Greg, for
No
joining me in
worries.
today. And believe you me, your insights, they were really educative and informative. And I really appreciate your time in joining me in today. And any ending note that you would like to give before we sign off?
I think that the key thing is, you're on a journey. If you're going to the cloud, you're on a journey. That may not be the ultimate destination. Keep your eyes wide open, be looking around, and everything is not the same. So why treat everything the same?
True that, true that. And also, I would like to tell the audience, in case you're new to Azure Storage, or even if you're into it, I would still recommend you to head over to Microsoft Learn, the official Microsoft documentations. You have plethora of learning paths and modules over there, and you can really dive into each one of these services that we've just spoken about today. And yep, thank you so much once again.
No worries. My pleasure. Thanks, everybody.